Hello again. This video will be posted on New Year's Eve, so we're here starting off the last day of 2024, and I thought in a fairly relaxed way we'd look back at books that I've read during this year. Now most of them are new ones, so they might not be familiar to people, but books about history, particularly about the ancient world. They'll mostly be ancient Greek and Roman books, but a few others as well that simply interested me or that I thought are worth mentioning. Some are new that have been published. There's one even that hasn't actually been published yet, but will be in a few weeks' time, but I've read because I was sent a copy to review. And a couple where there's one case where I've had the book for several years, but I hadn't had the chance to read it, so I'll put that one in. Another one that I reread recently and was actually published a few years ago, but I wanted to vary it a little bit and maybe point out a few things that people are less familiar with. So let's start with the ancient world, though, and let's start with... I'm going to look first of all at Paul Rahe's book, Sparta's Third Attic War, which is the latest in a series that I think stretches to 6 so far, where he's looked at the Spartan state and, in a much wider context, Spartan strategy through from a sense of what Sparta is like in the latter part of the 6th century, but then focusing on the first book is the Spartan regime, which is more general about his take on Spartan society, and then the strengths and weaknesses of that system that produces these remarkable, by Greek standards, more efficient fighting men, hoplites of the phalanx than other states, but also the problems that the limits on Spartan's ability to project its power, because you're relying upon the labour force of this unwilling helot population to support those full citizens so that they actually have the time to train and prepare for war to a degree that was unmatched by any other Greek state at that time. So in the first one, he very much sets up the Spartan system, his understanding of it, and sets the course for then looking in more detail, specifically, effectively giving you a sweeping, a long history of the 5th century BC, and the first one deals with the Persian Wars. I think it's called the Persian Challenge, something like that, and then you go on to the build up to the first war with the Athenians, the First Attic War, second the expedition to Syracuse, which again the Spartans are involved with indirectly, and then the Third Attic War. They've been coming out now since over the last decade or so. It's already a remarkable series because these are first-rate works of scholarship, but they're also very, very readable. So if you have an interest in classical Greek history, let alone Sparta, you need to read these. There are problems. Obviously, the nature of the evidence for talking about Sparta is problematic in so many ways, because even at the time in the ancient world, the Spartans were notoriously secretive about how and why they did things. And they didn't write literature of their own. It's what others have written about them. Now, some of them are people like Xenophon, with living in Sparta with good connections, some sense he probably could understand the society, even though he's Athenian. Though again, how far his understanding of how things worked in his day can be applied back to earlier periods is questionable. But an awful lot of stuff comes to us much later through people like Plutarch, who are writing in the Roman period, by which time the tradition of the Spartans as very peculiar, unusual, incredibly rigid, incredibly disciplined, very tough in their lifestyle, has been developed, perhaps exaggerated, and it's very hard to know. The basic problem is there's nothing else. If you reject these sources, then what do you put in their place? Because there is nothing there to go, and there's no alternative. So there is this one tradition that we know probably has problems, probably isn't telling us everything. It's certainly not telling us the whole story, even if, and some of what it tells us may not be correct, even within the narrow limits of focus. So you can disagree with the interpretations that are presented in these books, but you definitely have to take them into account. They are well worth delving into. As I say, if you have any interest beyond a sort of fairly mild one and you want to get a sense, there's been another tradition within scholarship of Anton Powell and Hodgkinson and all these people who've tended to try and unpick the Spartan mirage that was famously called by a French scholar in the 20th century, and have cast doubt upon a lot of this evidence, a lot of this depiction of Sparta as a unique society, and have tried to emphasize the aspects where actually it seems within the broader range of how Greek cities did things. And there's a lot to be said for much of this, though again, it's very hard to prove many of these ideas. Rahe's approach is perhaps more traditional, but as I say, you should, if you can disagree with it, because it's impossible for him to prove his case in many situations. All he can do is present the evidence, say, well, this is the most likely, this is the most convincing, and he develops. These are books that build upon the assumptions of earlier books, so he has come to conclusions as to how he feels Sparta worked, that then he presents as being borne out by subsequent history. And as I say, he makes a very good case. It isn't flawless, it isn't foolproof, because it can't be with the nature of the sources, but these are that rare quality of very important pieces of scholarship that are also readable. I mean, it helps the more detail that you have for the wider world in the background, but nevertheless, this is, I think, worthwhile for anybody who's got that level of interest. So while it's quite hard to pick on one of these books and say, this is something that's notable, I've singled out the Third Attic Wall because it's the most recent, and it's only been out a few weeks. But they're highly recommended, as I say. I think if you have an interest in classical Greek history, you need to have an interest in Sparta. You need to try and understand it, and particularly if you want to understand the bigger events, the conflicts with Persia, the rivalry with Athens, and the development, which will play such a fundamental role in changing the nature of classical Greece and will lead us into the 4th century and the dominance of Macedonia and so on, and the decline of cities like Sparta. So he's dealing with that longer problem that while the Spartans do very well and they're able to prevail in the conflict with Athens, Sparta will then be beaten by the Thebans fairly soon afterwards, and it's in serious decline, and it has major problems with population. The decline in the number of full citizens has been so drastic that it limits what the Spartans can do. So there's a lot to be said. There's a huge amount. This isn't really something where I can pick in and say, well, he talks about this and this is it. There's a great deal that's interesting. This is a very clear and insightful view of Spartan history. There are other ways of looking at many of these events. That doesn't mean those other ways are right. It's just that the sources leave considerable degree of doubt, but this is a really important set of studies that, as I say, works on a scholarly level, but also works for the enthusiast. So, well worth starting. It's probably worth reading them in order, even though they do stand alone. That gives you a better sense of how he's dealing with the type of evidence, nature of the society, and it comes into, the one on the Persian Wars, for instance, is a pretty good history of the Persian Wars, because he does not neglect episodes like Salamis and things like that, where the Spartans aren't necessarily playing the key role. Even though there's a Spartan commander, there aren't Spartan ships, there are relatively few of them in the fleet, compared to, say, Plataea, and he's very balanced on Thermopylae and all these things. There is a good analysis of the Marathon campaign. Again, I would probably differ over details, but that's because there's no certainty in the sources. There are so many problems with understanding that campaign, because Herodotus, our main account, just doesn't tell us lots of things we feel are really important to know. But again, he might be right. These are very rational, logical, insightful interpretations. It's just that the evidence doesn't allow for a final, simple answer in so many cases. So that's my Greek recommendation of things that I'm not sure which ones I've read for the first time this year, other than the most recent one, but it's well worth a look. So I would heartily recommend those for anybody with an interest in classical Greece, and you can find them on Amazon, both in the UK and in the United States. For the Romans, let's move on to the Romans, as we always should. Not necessarily a light read, and I think it was actually out the very end of last year, so the end of 23 rather than 24. I reviewed it for the New Criterion or something like that. But Robert Norstein Marks, Julius Caesar and the Roman Republic. It's a heavy book. There's a lot of detail discussing the political aspects of Julius Caesar's career, and particularly his championing of popular causes throughout his career. So it doesn't just focus on the end, it tries to put it all into context and tries to analyse not just what Caesar's doing, but what everybody else is doing. So it's a level of detail beyond the one I could go to in my biography of Caesar, and of course it's more recent, so there are new theories, new ideas that have come along from that. Again, this is a field where the evidence often doesn't allow for a definitive answer, and we simply can't say, we're guessing. The evidence is much better than it is, say, for classical Sparta. We know more about Roman society, we know more about how the Roman Republic worked, how the aristocracy functioned, the basic details of events and the mechanisms that underlay them. The evidence is simply that much better. On the other hand, there's still gaps. There are still things we don't know. So this, for those with an interest in the Roman Republic, it's well worth a look. It's not a light read because it has to discuss in detail a lot of these issues and go through the evidence and the sources. So it helps if you've already come and you have a fair idea of the basic narrative. That's probably not, all of that's an advantage if you're reading Paul Rahe's stuff, but I think you probably could follow that through from the start without knowing anything else. You might find it hard, but you should be able to follow because you're told enough. With this, I think it would help if you've got a decent grounding in 1st century BC Roman history and Roman society. But again, I can tell from the comments that we were getting for these videos, there are plenty of people out there who have. So if you haven't looked at this, while it may look a bit intimidating for its weight and its length and its depth, it's well worth a look. There's lots of interesting ideas in it. There's lots of interesting interpretations. Again, I might differ on particularly, I think, the way he interprets Caesar's interaction with the army, the importance of different ranks, particularly centurions and people like that, and other officers, and their political aspect. I'd probably push things a different way, but that doesn't mean I'm right. As with all these things, it's just that there again is room for interpretation. So there's an awful lot in there that's very good and well worth looking at. And if you're keen on this period and the personalities, and if you don't mind a work that requires you to concentrate, because there is a lot of detail in there, then this is well worth a look. Also of interest, and this is the one that hasn't come out yet but will be in a couple of weeks' time, so the beginning of 2025, but I've had a copy already. On the same period, Josiah Osgood, the Lawless Republic, the Rise of Cicero and the Decline of Rome. This is a very interesting idea. I know people may have come across some of Osgood's work before. There's one on Caesar and Cato, for instance. It came out a year or so ago. That's, again, very readable, highly recommended. Here he looks at the career of Cicero and particularly focuses on his court cases and the published speeches, the surviving speeches that we have. And through those looks, first of all, the context of the case itself, what's going on, what's involved, why are these issues important, then the wider historical context of what's happening in the broader Republic and how at the different stages of Cicero's career, when he's obviously starting out in the aftermath of Sulla's dictatorship and you're building up to the Verrine orations in 70 and all this sort of thing, the context of what's going on, the personalities, so lots of big names will feature in this book, but he's trying to tell it from a different way, and it's very well done. It's interesting in that it makes you think about the court cases and their role and how Cicero's doing things, the arguments he makes, the people, the society, what sort of issues are leading into these confrontations in the legal arena that are occurring in public in the centre of Rome. Remember, courts are being conducted on raised platforms in the forum, and anybody who wants to turn up can hang around and listen to see what's going on. You don't have to be involved. And Cicero will periodically speak to the corona, the sort of circle of people, the crowd around the edge of the loafers, hoping that if you get a sense of their mood, that they can maybe influence the judge and jury. So he brings all of that to life very well, how it all works, the personalities of those involved and the society. And it's a very good way. It's not something, it's again, I remember getting the book and thinking, oh, that's an interesting idea. It never occurred to me before of telling it this way. So again, for the many folk out there who like the first century BC and that era and the Ciceros and the Caesars and the Pompeys and all these people, this is a very interesting take. It's a slightly different slant, and this is deliberately set out to be more accessible. So it's a shorter book. There's much. He doesn't go into points of detail at quite the same length as Morstein Marx. He's doing a different thing. It's a different type of book. So this is one that's easier to read even if you don't know too much about the period already. Although again, the more you know, the more you will benefit from this, the more you will learn, because it'll make you think, oh yeah, okay, I'd not really thought of it that way, or I hadn't realised this person's related to that or connected with that, or that one of the issues involved in this case is actually reflected in a land law that comes out now, or a cause that's being presented by a leading politician or a tribune or something like this. So it's well worth a look. That one, as I say, is out soon, but one to look out for. Other than that, we'll leave the ancient world for this point. Again, thinking through, I've read a lot of ancient history this year, as I always do. These are some of the sort of the newer ones that I think might draw interest, and I won't go into the academic articles and books and things that are not necessarily so light. We'll do some others. We might do a session on books on the Roman army at some point during the year, and recommended. I mean, I've already done some recommended reading, but others that people may or may not know about, and that might, or they might not realise what's in some of them. It might be worth doing, but we'll leave that for another time. This is meant to be a fairly short one, and just some suggestions of stuff from outside the normal. So we'll jump on. There are other things I can mention, and maybe I'll remember at some point, but we'll leave the ancient world just with those 3 recommendations, or slightly more than that, given that Paul Rahe's book is part of a series, and also I'd say Osgood's book on Caesar and Cicero is worth a look as well. So this one on Caesar and Cato, as well as this one on Cicero. One that was a reread, because I read it when it came out, I think in 2021, and a bit different. We're leaping now to the 18th century, and this is Albert Louis Zamboni, Daniel Morgan, A Revolutionary Life. Daniel Morgan, the commander of the riflemen, who featured heavily in first of all, the attack on Canada, but then the 1777 campaign that led to the Saratoga surrender of Burgoyne's army, and then subsequently was in the southern campaigns, and particularly, was the commander at Cowpens, where he defeated Banasta Tarleton and largely destroyed his army by killing some and capturing most of the others. That removed a lot of the light infantry component. Strategically, it was only a small battle with not much more than 1,000 British troops, and maybe not more than twice that of the Americans. Again, this is an older book, but Lawrence Babbitt's A Devil of a Whipping on Cowpens is well worth a look if you have an interest in the period and haven't read that. He argues for the American army being larger than Morgan let on, because Washington needed the victory to be attributed to the Continentals. He didn't want Congress to cut them the money, so if they could rely on militia that were wonderfully cheap. So there was a tendency to play down the role and the numbers of militia who turned up just for a day or two and fought the battle and then went home, but could play a very important role in that time. Anyway, that's an aside. But this is one of the reasons I like this, and one of the reasons I went back and read it again, is that it tells you the story of an interesting figure involved in these big events, but also it places Morgan within the context of society at the time, and that's what you always want to do as a historian. You always want to get a sense that I'm learning about a human being like and other human beings like myself, but I'm also, what's the society? How do things work economically? What does it mean to be wealthy at this time? What sort of property are you involved in? What sort of businesses are you involved in? What's your stake in all of this? Why are you motivated to act in this particular way? So it's very good on that sort of thing. So again, if you've got an interest, well worth a look if you can find it. Moving on a bit to the Napoleonic Wars, Gareth Glover's marching, fighting and dying experiences of soldiers in the Peninsular War. I've had this on my shelf for a while and I hadn't got around to reading it until this year. I've probably mentioned Gareth's work before. He's found and published and edited a huge number of otherwise unknown personal accounts of the Waterloo campaign, and then more broadly the Peninsular War, and more broadly the Napoleonic era in general. and there's a huge amount of information. Having written novels on that period before, there's so much more material that he's discovered for those little details of what it was like to be on campaign. This is really the bringing those together, so putting it all together, a sense of campaigning life, skirmishes, battles, medical treatment, all this sort of thing, what it was like. And that's useful if you're interested in the period. It's also, things like this are well worth looking at if you just have an interest in warfare in any pre-modern period, when everybody's marching on foot or they're riding on horseback and all the transport is coming not by rail, let alone by motor transport, but it's being carried in carts, it's being carried on the backs of animals or people. Because some of the aspects of how armies behave really do extend back and were much the same in the ancient world. So for our, the main period and the main concern of my work, and I think most of the people looking at this YouTube channel, is the ancient world. It's the Romans, it's the Greeks, it's others in that period. You can learn a lot by looking at the armies of the Napoleonic era and before. In particular, things start to change as the 19th century goes on, but there's very many aspects of campaigning, of supply, of organization, of transfer of orders, of even aspects of the fighting. When you're fighting in close order formations, how large numbers of men maneuver on a battlefield. Looking at these eras can help you to understand what went on in the ancient world, even though there are obviously differences as well, and we've got to be very careful not to project back. This is useful. It's a very useful tool of the trade, and for anyone with a serious interest in ancient warfare, I think it's an incredibly good idea to read as much as you can about other periods as well. Try and bring in a wider sense of what's possible, of how things might be done, and therefore then consider, well, maybe they're doing that in the ancient world. Maybe they are, maybe they're not, but at least we're considering options for things that wouldn't be done that way in the modern era, but we don't necessarily we wouldn't necessarily think of them unless we've seen how they're done in another period. So heartily recommend that. There are also, the Gareth publishes at a prodigious pace, so there are several new memoirs and others that I haven't got around to reading yet, but I hope to do so. I can't always keep up. There are several of his that I've got, like this one, that wait for a while until I've got the time to read them. So that's it. We'll stick with the 19th century and leave it at that. We'll just move on, and we'll have a couple of Second World War ones because I've got Hill 112 out and I've been interested, and just generally because I'm interested. And I think, yes, I know most people who come to this site and this channel are primarily interested in the ancient world. There are a fair few of you out there who are like other periods of history as well. So we'll just do a couple of Second World War ones. There's always tons of stuff being published on the Second World War. One, again, it's a series that I'm partly through. I'm in the third volume, I think now, is the Dilip Sarkar. It's got a series of the Battle of Britain, done, I think, by the Battle of Britain Memorial or Trust or something like that, or their Pen and Sword or one of its offshoots published, and they're looking at the Battle of Britain day by day. Now that means that the depth of information is huge, and it's a lot of it draws on combat reports put in by the pilots at the time, and then tries to correlate those with German reports and German sources. I've only got to the latter part of August so far. I'm in the third volume, that very intensive fighting around there. The first one is the build up to the war, the development of the various aircraft. They haven't been too well proofread. I think they've been rushed through, but there's something like 7 or 8 of them altogether, and I will work my way through. Not necessarily light reading, and it helps if you know the background, but in terms of giving you an impression of what it was really like, because there's a tendency, if you write a book about something like the Battle of Britain, it focuses on the sort of highlights or becomes very generic. When you actually look and you see the number of squadrons that are scrambled, go off on patrol and don't find anything, or chase a reconnaissance aircraft, don't necessarily bring it down, of the accidents that occur, the people who crash on landing, the ones who get lost, and then the bigger encounters and the successive engagements as squadrons are vectored in and intercept them, and the development of how fighter command is changing, how it's reacting, and how the Germans are trying to, again, it's each side trying to outthink the other and outsmart the other. Doing it that day-by-day thing gives you a slightly different perspective. It reminds you of how much of a slog this all was. Whereas there's a tendency to sort of do, Eagle Day, maybe the 18th of August, the hardest day, and then jump on to highlights and when the Germans change and start bombing London and all this sort of thing. So it's a lot to be said. It's almost like commentary. You know, Cicero talks about these as material for history than history itself. It's not. It's more than that. But it is. It's a very useful. It reminds you of how these events are actually playing out day to day. There's a book I read years ago, The War the Infantry Knew, by a chap called Dunn, about I think it's the Second Royal Welsh Fusiliers, you know, the battalion that Siegfried Sassoon and Robert Graves, people like that, served in the First War. And it covers the battalion's entire war from 1914 onwards, and you see how it changes, how the personnel of this regular battalion become casualties and get replaced, and some come back in after recovering from wounds and this. But again, it reminds me that the First World War isn't just the big days of the big battles. It's lots more than that, and the attrition from the minor encounters that goes on. So it gives you a different perspective. But we'll finish with the last one, and this is Al Murray's Arnhem Black Tuesday, which I read when it came out a couple of months ago, I think probably in September for the 80th anniversary. It's an interesting take. Arnhem is one of those things that interests me. If you manage to sit all the way through my one on historical films, We Got to the Bridge Too Far is one of my favourite films near the end. For all its flaws, there's still a lot. I keep coming back and watching it again and again. I've read a lot about it. This was interesting because it was a particular take. He just looks at one day, 24 hours, the Tuesday. He looks at 4 stages during the day at what's happening in different parts of 1st Airborne Division's area. So you've got what's happening at the bridge, what's happening in Oosterbeek, what's happening at different parts around the landing and drop zones, the Hartenstein, and in some of these areas, you know, people are actually having a very quiet day and not much is happening, but others where they're encountering opposition. It's told from the British side, British perspective entirely, though obviously he's informed and aware of what's going on. I just found it interesting. It made me think in a different way about a very familiar subject, and there were things where I thought, I never really thought of that. So it's interesting, even if Arnhem is such a well-trodden path, you can say something new about it. So I'd recommend that for people with an interest in the Second World War, and particularly the war in Northwest Europe, let alone if they've got an interest in Arnhem. It's well worth a look. I hadn't read, I think I'll have to search out, he's got a book on British Command in the Second World War. I'd read his book about sort of autobiographical one, we were given that for Christmas, about watching war films with my dad or something like that. And he's probably well known from We Have Ways podcast and all that sort of thing. So lots of people who are already Second World War enthusiasts will know. But for somebody who's already had a career as a comedian, this is very good history. So it's worth a look. It's an interesting take on, as I say, a theme you think is familiar, but it reminds you that there's always new things to learn, and there's always new ways of approaching and thinking about the same situation. So, well worth a look if you're interested. I didn't include it in this talk because I've only just started it. It was a Christmas present. I'm on James Holland's book on Casino, and the mostly 1944 in Italy, and that's as enjoyable as those always are. So but I haven't finished that, so I thought I wouldn't include that in the thing, whereas all of these are ones that I've read in other respects, and read during the course of the last year, the last 12 months, even if, as I say, in one case it's reading it for a second time. So anyway, those are just some thoughts, some books that people may not have spotted and that might be of interest. I've tried to explain why, and hopefully that'll give a sense of whether it's for you or it's not for you. Some of you may be interested in some periods, not in others, some more generally, but I think all of those, one thing I'd characterize, they're all pretty readable as well as being interesting. And even Morstein Marx, which is quite a serious scholarly work, it's not a hard slog reading it, as some scholarly works can be. Even when the ideas are great, they make it hard for you to get there. There's a degree of communication in all of these things that I think you need for a good book, and you should have, and that even the most sophisticated academic ideas deserve as well, as far as it's possible within the constraints of actually explaining yourself, that you need to communicate, try and talk to the audience, and not just take their interest for granted. So anyway, there are some thoughts on some reading, some books that you may not have seen. Again, if anybody's got other suggestions of their own they want to add in the comments section, and there might be some that I've actually read and just don't remember because I read them months and months ago or something like that. It's always hard to think back, what have I done in the last 12 months? But anyway, it seems to be a fad for newspapers and TV where they round things up by bringing out things from the year. So that's my take, and I apologise to anyone I've forgotten, particularly if as I say, I'm pretty sure there are some books that I have read and thought, that's really good, but I just haven't recalled them in the last day or so when I've been thinking about this particular talk. So anyway, that's it for our New Year's Eve video. Best wishes for 2025 for everybody. I'll post one more tomorrow when we'll look at how the Roman year began for the Roman consuls. We'll do a little bit of Roman history before we go on, and then we'll just say a bit about how I see the channel developing and my plans for what I'm going to post on it during the 2025. But anyway, thanks for watching today, and as I say, best wishes for the new year to everybody. Thanks. Bye.